Hello and welcome to another video with dee'stuition. Today we are going to look at the poem London from the AQA Power and Conflict Poetry series, and London is written by William Blake. Let's get into it. So, as an overview to the poem, this poem is written from the perspective of Blake himself as he walks through the streets of London. And as he walks through those streets, he starts to remark on all of the negative aspects that he comes across, of which there are many. Each of the stanzas within the poem gives a different negative aspect of London, and it goes some way to describing his own perceptions based on how people are being treated and how the city itself is being treated and exploited in many ways. The context of the poem then. So first of all, this is set in 18th century Britain in London. Now during this time, Britain was a very, very strong empire, and there was a lot of money and commerce coming into the country, but of course not everybody was benefiting from that. Britain was not only strong, but it was strong for a select few. Poorer people had very little power and very little protection by the laws of the country, and this meant that life for poor people was very difficult. Rich and poor people lived in very close proximity, but their lifestyles were hugely juxtaposed. Now, if you want a modern day example of this, in London itself, if you think of the Grenfell Tower disaster, within the borough that Grenfell was positioned, you have rich and poor people in very close proximity, but the lifestyles vary massively. So there's a juxtaposition still within London today that Blake was remarking on during the 18th century. Blake was a romantic poet. He was one of the romantics, and as a result of that, it meant that he was very anti-establishment, meaning that he tried to go against the status quo. He didn't believe or like or respect the government and how they went about their daily kind of business and the way that they treated the citizens within the city. He wanted a fairer society, and this poem really goes some way to show the injustice that was present not just in London, but in major cities across the country. Of course, Blake was living in London, so he focuses on that. As well as this poem comes from a collection of poems called Songs of Experience. All of the poems within this collection talk more about the kind of darker, the more dreary side of life, and this poem fits into that quite perfectly. So, some key quotations for us to look at. The first one is Chartered Street, Chartered Thames. Now, the importance of this quote is a structural importance because you've got this repetition of chartered, meaning used or rented, used for business. It means that nothing is off limits in terms of the government using things, natural resources, to make money. So the streets and, of course, the River Thames, both being used for business. However, not only are these natural resources being exploited, only some people reap the benefits of that exploitation. And it really goes some way to showing what a money-oriented society is, what a capitalist society it is. Second key quotation is mind forged manacles. Now this is really, really important as well. If we focus on that word manacles, that noun, manacles are essentially handcuffs. Now mind forged manacles means the handcuffs that are produced within our minds. So here we get the idea of poor mental health, people being trapped by their circumstances, or certainly being made to feel like they are trapped by their circumstances. Now, of course, here he would be talking about the poorer members of society rather than the richer ones. and they are really stuck in a rut, and they are really stuck in a position that they wouldn't really know how to get out of. Third quotation, every blackening church. Now again, this is a really, really important quotation. This adjective of blackening isn't an adjective that we would normally associate with churches. Of course, blackening gives connotations of sort of dirt, of corruption, of evil. Now, we wouldn't ordinarily associate that with churches. Ordinarily, we would associate the colour white and not the colour black. But Blake has chosen this colour, these connotations very specifically to show that these religious organisations were not helping in the way that they should have been. They were not helping poor people to thrive. They were not helping poor people to become more advantageous. In fact, they were helping the richer people to continue to create this hierarchy between themselves and the other members of society. And of course, you would expect church and religion to be all about equality. But during the 18th century, this isn't something that was the case. And Blake was heavily criticising the church and heavily criticising religion because he couldn't see how religion or the church was making things better for anybody. The fourth quote, runs in blood down palace walls, a beautiful piece of imagery here. And when I say beautiful, I don't mean that the image is beautiful, but what I do mean is that it really brings the poem to life, runs in blood down palace walls. Now, not only is it imagery, but it's metaphorical too. It's really talking about those soldiers, those people that go off to war, that die for the royal family, who essentially don't care about them. You have got soldiers who are risking their lives for people that think nothing of them, that do not protect them. It also could suggest that rich people, like the royals, have blood on their hands because the walls protect the rich and keep them clean. Meanwhile, the poorer members of society, the working class, are going out there and risking their lives and really not earning anything as a reward. Final quotation, youthful harlot's curse. Now, this quotation is particularly powerful because you've got emotive language, but also you've got that oxymoron between youthful and harlots. Now, harlots is just an old-fashioned word for prostitutes. So where it talks about youthful harlots, it's quite surprising. It's quite frightening, really, in some ways, because you don't expect young people to be associated with prostitution. But during the 18th century, many prostitutes were very, very young women, and they used prostitution as a way of trying to get out of poverty to help both themselves and also to help their families. Now, if you've ever heard of Jack the Ripper, who is a very famous serial killer who famously killed prostitutes, those women that were killed were very, very young women. And what this quote also shows is that children are exploited. And of course, the poem also talks about chimney sweepers, which is another form of exploitation. It also shows that there are little options for poor people, particularly poor young people, and that people turned a blind eye to these things. Prostitution was rife during the 18th century in London. Many men indulged in prostitution, even though the prostitutes were young women themselves. So, main takeaways from this poem are: number one, in a capitalist society, only the upper echelons can benefit. In capitalist societies, the poor will always stay poor and they will always be exploited for the sake of money. Organised religion often does very little to help fight inequality and instead turns a blind eye, which of course is ironic. Religion should bring people together and create equality, and yet often we find it doesn't do that. When the youth within a society are lost or exploited or abandoned and abused, society has no real way of improving. And that's why Blake really talks about those negative aspects, because the youth aren't cared for, and therefore, as far as he's concerned, society has completely broken down. And finally, a divided society is, of course, no society at all, and leads to things like revolutions, overthrowing, rebellions, etc. And Blake does give a nod to the French Revolution within this poem. So that's all. If there are any questions that you've got about this poem, please leave them in the comments. And of course, don't forget to like, share, subscribe. Thank you.